My thesis topic is on does formalization solve the unemployment problem? And I look at developing economies. I look at the panel data of developing economies. So it's basically a cross country analysis of unemployment. So the main motivation is that I come from a developing country, and many developing countries are characterized by informal employment. The labor markets, I mean, in these countries are characterized by informal employment. And it can be overwhelmingly large, right? That's over 80% of the employed in India, Indonesia, and Laos. It's about 60% in my country, the Philippines. And what does informal employment mean? It means that you do not have a contractual employer-employee relationship. You have no paid annual and sick leaves. You have no social security coverage. I was once informally employed as well. So there's a certain level of uncertainty in being informally employed, right? But this also happens in developed economies, mostly among gig economy workers, platform workers, self-employed, and own account workers. But by and large, the majority of this occurs in developing countries. So by and large, there is an understanding that formal employment is characterized by better protection and working conditions. And so for ILO, for different multilateral agencies, formalization is a declared yet effective policy aim. Right? Many people are saying, even local politicians are saying we should formalize the labor market, but it's quite hard to achieve. And the idea of the question of the research is to ask, does an increase in labor market formalization, which I measure as the percentage of wage and salaried workers in an economy, which is one of the multiple proxies that you can use for formalization, does it solve or exacerbate the unemployment problem? So that gives you an idea of what my dependent and independent variables are. But in very simple language, it's, do more better quality jobs lead to less overall jobs? Because one may think that because of better quality jobs, right, it gets more and more expensive to retain workers and to hire workers, because now you have to pay social security contributions, whereas if you employ them informally, you don't have to, right? There are more protections afforded to employees that would also entail some costs on the part of the employers. And so the literature says that this relationship is ambiguous, right? It could increase unemployment, right? Formalization can increase unemployment, particularly because it does increase labor turnover costs, as I mentioned, right? So now you have hiring costs, you have firing costs, whereas if you employ a worker informally, those costs do not exist, or may exist, but not by much. But there's also a strand of the literature arguing that no, formalization actually reduces unemployment. And the reason is because job security provisions increase average employment duration. So, which means that if I am formally employed, the longer I get to stay, or I want to stay in my job, rather than being informally employed, because I have more stability in formal employment. And because I have a longer average employment duration, it becomes more and more costly for the firm to get rid of me, right? And so that increases the labor turnover costs, so to speak. And because of that, it will reduce unemployment. The longer people stay in a job, right? Uh, that has unemployment reducing effects. So you can see that the literature is a theoretically ambiguous prediction to the nexus, right? One is saying it will increase unemployment, the other is saying it will reduce unemployment. And so these are the two channels that I wish to capture in my empirical analysis. So uh, what I use is I use a panel of 90 developing countries over 20 years. So 2000 to 2019. And I use a panel of 90 developing countries, which was shortlisted based on the completeness of their data, which is available online. Right? And the paper finds three things. The first is that Formalization without corresponding increases in output and productivity induces unemployment, which means that the more and more wage and salaried workers there are in an economy as a fraction of your total employment, it will induce unemployment, holding output and productivity constant, right? Which means that maybe later I'll explain that as well. But for developing countries, it's really output and productivity growth that matters, right? So if you sort of expand formal employment and expand formalization, but the economy does not grow, right? Or the economy or job creation does not catch up to the higher costs that is associated with formalization, then that would generate basically less overall employment, right? Or more unemployment. So that's finding number one. Finding number two is that there's an exception, actually. If a country has relatively, really, really low levels of formal employment, and I estimate that critical point to be around 43% of the employed, then formalization helps address unemployment. These are countries with extremely low levels of formal employment, which also means they have low levels of output, GDP, low levels of productivity, GDP per capita. And so the idea is any movement in formalization implies an uptick in economic activity. And that uptick in economic activity is one that also helps in addressing the unemployment problem. So uh, I don't I don't think that this relationship, this second point, is causal in nature. But what I'm saying is there is an association that was found. The inflection points, finally, the inflection points, and even the shape of relationship varies based on countries, right? So, at what point does more formalization lead to more unemployment? So that estimated inflection point varies across countries, and it's just because different countries have different starting points of what their initial levels of formal sector employment are. And some people, like in Eastern Europe, even though they're a developing country, 90% of their country or of their employed is formally employed, right? Whereas this can be as low as 10% in some countries in Africa and South Asia. So that's just the explanation of it. Um, just some limitations that I wanted to flag about the study is formalization is a complex process that can be measured in different ways. I think I used wages and salaried workers as a fraction of employment as a proxy, and it's one that is not widely used, I would say, compared to other variables, right? One is the ILO estimates informal employment and employment outside the formal sector. So these are the two main measures of informality. But I didn't use this because number one, not all countries report informal employment or even estimate informal employment, and so it's a very it's there's very sparse data on it. It's very inconsistent, and if even if you look at the panel data, and if you try to estimate the panel data with so many blanks in between years, then you wouldn't get a proper statistically significant result. And so wages and salaried workers would be the closest proxy for that, because and it's a lower bound estimate because some formal sector employees can be non-waged or commission based. But this would be a minority, I would say. Okay, so the paper does not contribute to economic theory. I don't make new theory, and it has little limited to no external validity for developed economies. Some closing thoughts, no? Uh, so if we start with the question, does formalization solve the unemployment problem? The answer is no, it does not. It exacerbates the unemployment problem on average among developing economies. The next question is formalization a bad thing? Should we now stop pursuing for formalization? And that kind of depressed me towards the end of my thesis writing journey, because I felt like I was not arguing for something nice, because I'm like, stop formalization. but I realize in hindsight that I may be asking the wrong question. If it does not solve the unemployment problem, maybe it solves some other problems, right? Maybe it solves lack of poor working conditions or poor worker satisfaction. The problem of underemployment, right? Underemployment may be also a bigger, or may also be the direct problem that this one is trying to address. So these are extensions of the paper that can be done in the future. So yeah, just to show you what it looks like in very simple terms, let's say U-shaped curve, right? Showing you that at 43% more for above 43% more formalization leads to higher unemployment. What else? Yes, I get statistically significant results mostly, and yeah, by the way, I use a system generalized method of moments as an estimator, which is something that you use for dynamic panel data estimations. I guess I'll stop here and just wait for your questions. Thank you.